Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wendy Cromash. I am here with Linda Gartz for today's Levy lecture. We are going to be talking about Redlined, Linda's memoir about race, change, and fractured community in 1960s Chicago. It's a wonderful book. I've read it. It's a great story about her family and Chicago history, and I recommend it. I want to thank the Levy Senior Center Foundation for providing the support and the infrastructure and the funding to make these Levy lectures possible. Also a big shout out to Abador Evanston. Thank you very much for your support. And without any further ado, I am going to turn this over to Linda.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I want to add my thanks to the Levy Senior Center Foundation, and a special shout out goes to Wendy Cromash for all the work and efforts she put in with me to make this the best Zoom experience for you guys possible. So without further ado, we'll go and get started. Okay, my book at its most basic is about family and real estate. And Redlined, in a simple summary, is the story of my family's lives on Chicago's West Side before, during, and after the racial changes of the 1960s, interwoven with the history and impact of redlining. Now, when we speak about redlining, there are many people who don't really understand what redlining is, and I just have a very, again, at its most basic, redlining was the federal government's policy of discriminatory loans, especially home loans, to African Americans and other minorities from 1933 to 1968. They refused loans to African Americans based on color-coded maps, and the impact of that policy is still with us, and we'll get into that in more detail later. I think that if we look back into the last century, my book takes place over several decades, but its main focus is in the 1960s. And I think many of you would agree that the 1960s was probably one of the most tumultuous decades, if not the most tumultuous decade of the last century. Now, this is an image from just one of the events of one of the worst years of the 1960s. It was August 28th, 1968, and we can see this melee between Chicago police officers and demonstrators at the Conrad Hilton Hotel during the Democratic National Convention. And of course, that was just one of the horrible things that happened in 68, not to mention the whole decade. I mean, in 68, we had all these several assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. We also saw riots throughout the country, Vietnam War protests and the deaths in Vietnam, and of course, the civil rights movement. So it was a very tumultuous time. And I am going to make the argument that we are once again living in a very tumultuous time. We are facing twin crises, the pandemic, which we all know have been hunkered down on now since March, and now it looks like we're having more restrictions added again with a surge in the viruses. Now, these pandemic statistics tell us a good deal about who's being affected most by this terrible pandemic. As of November 15th, more than 246,000 Americans have died from COVID-19. And the CDC has determined that African Americans are dying at twice the rate of white Americans from COVID-19. Non-Hispanic Blacks, that's to differentiate them from Hispanic Blacks, non-Hispanic Blacks are hospitalized at 4.5 times the rate of non-Hispanic whites. So right there we see how the pandemic is unfairly and unevenly affecting people of color versus white Americans. And then the second crisis we're facing is the racial reckoning that occurred after the murder of George Floyd. Now, you, like I, probably saw that viral video of the oops, for some reason my Zoom presentation went to the wrong slide. Many of you saw that viral video of Officer Chauvin kneeling on the neck of George Floyd as people around them were calling out, please get off his neck, don't you know you're killing that man? And finally, when he stopped moving, saying, you just killed that man. The kind of implicit bias that allowed that to happen, to have this officer so casually murder somebody in front of the eyes of so many people, was just another example of the systemic racism that's in our society, similar to the systemic racism that we're going to talk about more when we get into more detail about redlining. Now, one of the things that occurred immediately after George Floyd's death is there was this spontaneous uprising of protests throughout the country and throughout the world. And here we see a couple of images of the protests that took place in Berlin and in London, but actually these protests were just in virtually every city in the world. And the thing that made these unusual was how many white people were protesting for racial justice. This was a first to have so many white people joining in. It's as if with that video of George Floyd, white people for the first time, were able to see what blacks had been talking about for decades. In real time, they saw a man killed in front of their eyes. Now, as often happens with protests, there are some bad actors, criminals, other people who just like to sow chaos, who want to take advantage of the situation. And that's exactly what happened with the George Floyd protests. Many fires were started and there was looting that occurred. And here is an image of a looted store very close to where I grew up. This exhausted store owner, Wasid Musa, sits amidst the rubble at his looted store, which is called African Food and Liquor. It was located in the 4100 block of West Madison Street. Now, I grew up in the 4200 block of Washington, so this looting occurred just a couple blocks from where I grew up. And there were several other lootings that went on as well. Well, when I saw this looting, it was like a deja vu for me. I was immediately taken back to 1968 and the riots and the looting that occurred at that time in my neighborhood. This is an aerial view of the burning West Side the day after Martin Luther King's assassination. He was assassinated on the 4th of April in 1968, and these riots took place on the 5th of April. And as you can see, it's just blocks and blocks of smoke reaching into the clouds. And if you were on the ground, you would see just blocks and blocks of burning buildings. It was a conflagration, and the firefighters desperately trying to get it under control. And if you'd like to actually see a film of those images, I have one on my website in my video book trailer on the first page. I was able to get about 10 seconds of the actual footage and the sound of what was going on at that time. The riots exploded after Martin Luther King's death in nearly 200 cities across America, and Chicago was one of the hardest hit. There were 9 people killed, 1,200 people injured, and over 200 buildings destroyed, nearly $9 million in property damage. And you know, in my book, I have an interview with a woman that lived on the West Side during that time. And she was telling me how there were actual tanks in the street and the sky was red, and her kids were saying, "Mommy, Mommy, what's that?" And she was trying to explain what was going on. But she said to me, it was as if we were in Vietnam. And this was just on the West Side of Chicago. And now this image here on the left is an image of a block on the West Side the day after the riots. And as you can see, nothing but charred skeletal remains of buildings are left. You can see how tall those buildings are when you compare them to the people in front of them. But this was a scene that you saw throughout the West Side. And then came in the bulldozers and they ripped down those buildings and cleared them away and left vacant lots. And still today, on the right-hand side, you see a picture just taken in 2018, 5th Avenue near Albany. This is right around actually Kedzie and Monroe, not far from Marshall High School. You see many of those vacant lots 52 years later are still with us. And these neighborhoods were, experienced disinvestment. All the businesses left. Any middle-class African-Americans who could leave left. The neighborhood was primarily African-American at the time. But my parents still own some buildings in this neighborhood during the riots and for many, many years afterwards. This is an image of my parents' first home. This image was taken in the early 1950s. My parents bought this house in December of 1958. We moved in June of did I say 58? I meant to say 1948. We moved in June of 1949. And, we moved right in with some tenants who lived there. We were on the way to be creating a rooming house. If you look at the building, if you can notice this, in the upper part of each of the windows in the front is like a rectangular window, and that window was leaded glass. It was just a beautiful building. And in the lower lower left-hand corner is an oval window that was also leaded glass. And when the sun would shine through the prisms of the leaded glass, it would throw these rainbows across the floor, and that just enchanted me as a child. As time went by, after the riots, as you know, the neighborhood became poorer and poorer and more crime came in, those windows became a great source of revenue for many of the thieves who liked to come to the buildings and actually cut them out of the buildings. And that happened with one of ours. Other times the owners would cut them out and sell them because they were worth something. But at the time my parents bought this building, the 1950 population shows that this area was 100% white. The way to look at that is out of a total population of 48,443 residents, only 23 identified as Black. So this was an all-white neighborhood, not that my parents even had to think about that. They just assumed, they saw it was an all-white neighborhood, and my father felt this was a good investment because he was following the leadership of his dad. This is a picture of my grandfather. My grandfather and grandmother moved their family to West Garfield Park in 1912 when my grandfather got his first decent paying job after immigrating here just a year before. He was an ethnic German who came from what is today Romania, but he spoke German, both my grandparents did. And there on the right-hand side, you could see a close-up. He was the sandwich man. This is kind of a little tidbit of information. You could get a schooner of beer, like you see all these guys. I don't see any women here. They probably weren't welcome. You can see these guys with their schooner of beer, and for 5 cents, you could buy a schooner of beer and get a free sandwich with it. And my grandfather's job was making those sandwiches. So after a while, he got involved in the janitorial business, and he was actually janitor for up to 65 apartments at one time. Now, he and my grandmother worked closely together. This is an image of my grandparents. This is his name in Europe would have been Josef. Here he was Joe, and Elisabetta, and she went by Lizzie, Gartz on their wedding day, October 13th, 1911. It's interesting to note that the next day they were up at 5 a.m. going to their respective jobs. Now, these people had an obsessive work and frugality mentality. They worked and saved obsessively for decades until they had enough money that my grandfather and grandmother were able to purchase homes of their own, both to live in and as an investment. And they had achieved the immigrant dream of home ownership. And my father saw that as a way for him also to invest. And that home ownership was their ticket to the middle class. Now, this is an image of my grandparents and my father's family in 1933 on Easter. So, of course, they're dressed in their Easter best. My grandmother also, I think, liked to have pictures taken regularly to send back to the old country to let them know just how well they were doing here. But as you can see, this looks like a seriously middle-class family. I'm sure they did not dress like this when they were working, but you know, they had the ticket to the middle class. And yet at the exact same time, the policies of redlining were denying home ownership and that ticket to the middle class that was available even to immigrants, people who weren't born in this country. My grandparents were definitely citizens by this time. I know that because I have their citizenship papers. So when my father made that investment at the building I showed you at 4222 West Washington, they didn't realize that they were living on a fault line of history. They couldn't anticipate that racial upheavals, like we saw earlier, would be taking place just 20 years hence. They also couldn't anticipate how the house itself would grind away at their love and relationship. And we'll talk a little bit more about that because these are some of the themes of Redlined. It was not, you know, it's certainly it is interwoven with the history of redlining, but a lot of the things that became themes were those kinds of things that bothered me and about my family when I tried to figure them out. These unanticipated racial upheavals, what caused them? The impact of redlining on communities, what really was redlining and how did it affect people? My parents' shifting relationship. I hope I could find out more about that. And then the impact of mental illness on the family. This is a picture of my mother, Lillian, with her mom, Louise Koroshetz. We called her Grandma Kay. And, you know, this is a very nice picture, but my grandmother was seriously mentally ill. She was actually diagnosed as a psychotic, and it was recommended that she be put into a home for mentally ill people. But my mother couldn't bear to do that and brought her home. So she ended up living with our family for 15 years. In fact, moved in with my parents just 10 months after they got married. So all these things were going on in my family at the same time the whole country was changing. Just to give you an idea of why I got involved in this, it was a startling event. After my mom died in 1994, my brothers and I were clearing out the house, separating trash from treasure, as we all do when we're ready to sell a home. And in the attic, we found our gold. There we discovered that my parents and grandparents had saved thousands and thousands of pages of letters, diaries, documents, photos, film, court records, and much, much more. We found so many good things, we divided them up into 25 banker's boxes, labeled each box with the person to whom the contents were relevant, and then they got stored in my garage. My brothers lived in Seattle, so this was, you know, easier for them to be stored here than pay storage. So there they sat for many years. I was busy raising a couple of children, and I really didn't have time to look at them. But I do want to give you a sense of how huge and vast this collection is. We created spreadsheets to catalog everything that was in the collection. And I don't expect you to be able to read this sheet, but it just gives you a sense of 1 out of 10 pages of the spreadsheet that we made to catalog the contents. And then I just spread out a small portion. This is a tiny portion from one of the boxes on the floor, just to give you a sense of you know, the kinds of things that are in there. And I emphasize this is a tiny portion. There you see several diaries open. In the upper right is a picture of my dad. I think that's a high school graduation picture. Down below left, you see pictures from the old country, and even a picture of my husband and me right in the middle at the bottom. So this is an example of the vastness of this collection. When I first decided that I wanted to look at what was in there, sort of a little voice called to me and saying, why don't you just see what's in there? So the first box I looked at was the box of letters from World War II to and from my uncle, Frank Abner Gartz. We always called him Abner. It's pronounced like the German way. The E is pronounced A, Abner. And I started reading these letters that my parents had written to him and then the letters he had written back. And I'll tell you, I was whisked back to the 1940s as if I were in an old film. I could see my parents in their everyday lives. My mom might be sewing a button on a coat and my dad writing poetry. I can see my grandparents in their daily workaday lives, my grandfather getting a terrible knee infection and my grandmother having to take on all the work. My uncle struggling to become a navigator. It was a very, very difficult course of study, and his parents were always encouraging him to keep going. But I was hooked. I decided I had to read more and more of these letters and diaries. And I have to say, as I went through more of them, the ones that tantalized me most, that I found the most fascinating, were the diaries that my mom kept of falling in love with my dad. And here's an image of her diary with her handwriting on the front. It goes from November 20th, 1939 to October 20th, 1941. And it was in that spring of 1941 that my mom and dad started their relationship. I'm going to read to you a little part of it, but first I just want to tell you what happened. So my mom decides to go down to Moose Hall, which is at Ontario and Dearborn, on May 10th, 1941, for a dance that was being held for young people. And whom should she see there but Fred Gartz? Now, she'd met him the previous November. They'd had a great time, but for some reason, he'd never called her for a date. So she thought, second chance. So she went up to him. She introduced herself. He introduced her to the rest of his family and friends. They fell into conversation. They danced the night away. And when my mom got home, she opened her diary and wrote this. There's no doubt about it. I'm in love with him. He's really the first man I've met that I think I'd like to marry. Intelligent, crazy, fun, and we have no end of things to talk about. Well, with that kind of entry on the first date, she must have been giving off positive vibes. So my dad was sort of slow on the uptake. It took him 3 months to ask her out for a date. And that date was set for August 15th, 1941. They went to the Lincoln Park, where there's also a zoo, as you know. They went to a movie, then they got a nice cold brewing beer and some sandwiches at Zeben's Brewery, and then they went back to the park. And I'm going to show you an actual image of my mother's diary, as well as an image of my parents. Before I read to you what she wrote about their foray into Lincoln Park, there's my dad and mom. This is actually in their third date, so it's still in August, and it's at North Avenue Beach. And I was able to connect the dots because I found her diary entry about this picture. So after their first date, my mom went home and she surely tore open her diary, and this is what she wrote. I think we both knew why we went back to the park. We sat on a bench hearing the lions roar and the quacking of a duck. Oh, it was heavenly. He knows all the little innuendos of kissing, and I ain't so bad myself, if I do say so. We kissed for about an hour and a half. Tonight was like a page from a storybook, and he definitely is the man I want to marry. Dear God, please let it come true. That's pretty heavy stuff. Well, she continued on with these kinds of ecstatic entries right after every date until May of 1942. My dad was a little more reticent and he hadn't really spoken up, but in May he found his voice and my mom recorded what he wrote. And this is just her actual handwriting in her diary. You can follow along a little bit, and we just have a few of the phrases at the left. Fred told me at 2:30 a.m. Sunday, May 17th, really that he loves me. One split second before he did so, I murmured, je t'aime, which of course he did not understand. Ever since then, we have been happier than ever before in our lives. Fred tells me the nicest things, that he loves me more all the time, that I get sweeter as time goes by, that he's never loved anyone like he loves me, and he has wanted many things badly in his life, but never anything half so much as he wants me. We have never had an argument since our first date on August 15th, 1941. So if we won't be happily married, who will? Well, that is young love. And I can tell you that by the time I was a teenager, my parents were definitely not happy. My mom, they were screaming at each other, and my father would often retreat because he hated to have confrontations. So piece by piece, I was just torn apart by their dissatisfaction with one another at this time. And I didn't know what had happened. So I thought that perhaps by reading the letters and diaries that I could get a clue as to what happened to their relationship. At the same time, I had another question. I wanted to know what happened to my neighborhood. Why, when one African American moved onto the block, did whites flee by the thousands and eventually by the tens of thousands? And for that, I had to do some deep research. And as part of that research, I learned about the Great Migration. Now, this is an image of a family. It says a Negro family just arrived in Chicago from the rural South. If you Google the Great Migration images, this image will always come up. And for the longest time, nobody knew actually the history of this image. This comes from a book called The Negro in Chicago, a study of race relations in a race riot that was written in the early 20s. The people who wrote this, the Chicago Commission on Race Relations, were trying to understand what had happened during the 1919 race riots that we had in Chicago. Many of you may know about that. The young boy who was hit with a rock, an African-American boy was swimming, hit by a rock, he drowned. When the blacks tried to say to the police what had happened, they arrested the black people instead of the white perpetrators. So that sparked a horrific race riot. And the purpose of this book was to try to understand, race relations and how things could change. And this is the image they used. Now, it wasn't until years later that Vernon Jarrett, who you may remember as a TV anchor, and he also happens to be the father-in-law, just as a side, of Valerie Jarrett from Obama's team, he did some research and found out where this family actually had come from and what the back story of them was. And recently I heard a report on WBEZ Curious City that brought this all back to life. This image of this family was first seen on the cover, the first page of the Chicago Defender. And you cannot read the caption, but this is what it says. Facing starvation, Scott Arthur and his family, driven from home like dogs, girls assaulted, sons burned at the stake by a Paris, Texas mob, arrive in Chicago without money and homeless. So this gives you an idea of the kind of terrorism that was really perpetrated against African Americans in the South. And I'm going to spend just about a minute or so reading to you from my chapter called Redlined, where I discuss a little more about the Great Migration and its impact on Chicago. This is chapter 9 called Redlined. Like most major cities in 20th century America, Chicago was rigidly segregated. African Americans were clustered primarily in Chicago's near west side and in the south side's Black Belt, a strip of land that stretched from about 28th to 70th Street in 1940 and inexorably expanded as blacks flocked to the city. Chicago's Black population had been burgeoning in these two neighborhoods ever since the beginning of the Great Migration, when vast numbers of Southern Blacks moved to northern states and California, starting near the end of World War I and gaining steam in a second wave after World War II. In the 1940s and 50s, 3 million Blacks fled north from the daily degradations and abuses of the Jim Crow South. Hundreds of thousands headed to Chicago, where the Black population nearly tripled from almost 278,000 in 1940 to more than 812,000 in 1960. Like my parents, many whites remained unaware that this massive population shift was underway, or the reasons behind it. They just knew they didn't want African Americans moving into their all-white neighborhoods. Most whites were certain that Blacks brought decay and dilapidation into every community they entered. When I was young, we sometimes drove through African American neighborhoods on our way elsewhere, and we witnessed blight firsthand. Sagging porches and dirty windows, no grass, only twisting weeds and dusty front yards, ill-clad little children playing in the street. A ferocious white backlash erupted when Blacks moved into an all-white area. And there are many, many examples of this, but I'm just going to give one. In July of 1953, a Black couple purchased a home in all-white South Deering on Chicago's South Side. For months, white crowds protested and rioted, hurling bricks, shooting off pistols, and attacking and injuring Black passers-by. One of the picketers proclaimed to a CBS reporter that she didn't want Blacks in her community because, quote, every place they've taken over, they've turned into a slum, end quote. Whites were certain that Blacks would devastate the communities, and alongside that, the whites' greatest investment, the value of their homes. In her epic book about the Great Migration, Isabel Wilkerson writes, and that book is The Warmth of Other Suns. It was an article of faith among many people in Chicago and other big cities that the arrival of colored people in an all-white neighborhood automatically lowered property values. That economic fear was helping propel the violent defense of white neighborhoods. The fears were not unfounded, Isabel Wilkerson writes, but often not for the reasons that white residents were led to believe. Years later, I learned that the real culprits behind the decrepitude and lowering value of white homes were the policies of the federal government in alliance with the real estate and mortgage sectors. In the 1930s, the newly created Home Owners Loan Corporation, along with the Federal Housing Administration and other government agencies, began ranking communities to assess their creditworthiness. So I'm going to go off the book now and just talk to you about what they did. Okay, this is a map, 1940s map from the site mappinginequality.com, and you could go there. It's a fantastic site. But what I like about this picture is instead of just showing you one city, this is an image of the entire country, and you can see how many cities used redlining as a way of determining who should get loans and who shouldn't. It stretches from Seattle in the Northwest to Miami in the Southeast, and of course, a lot of concentration in the Midwest and moving over to the East Coast. But what these maps were meant to do was let banks know where it was safe to lend. So they color-coded neighborhoods. not just cities, but neighborhoods. There were 4 colors. Green was the best, blue, still desirable, C, yellow, definitely declining, and D was hazardous. Now, even as you look over this map, you can see that most of these cities are yellow and red. But the thing about red is that if one African-American person moved into a community, that neighborhood was often redlined. And that meant nobody in that community could get a mortgage. Now, the whites could flee to the suburbs, and frankly, that's where most of the FHA money went. But the best neighborhoods that were labeled green, those would be primarily, they would be virtually all white neighborhoods with people with higher incomes and good housing stock. Blue, again, all white. Definitely declining. Still may not have had African Americans actually living in the neighborhood, except maybe just a tiny handful, but definitely declining. We'll take a look at that later. And then, of course, as I said before, hazardous. And on the right, you can see HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, was actually created in 1933. But in 1935, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board asked the Homeowners Loan Corp to look at 239 cities and create what they called residential security maps for real estate investments in each surveyed city. So now this is a map of Chicago, and it's kind of a cross section in the middle of Chicago. The red line at the far right is downtown Chicago, and the line goes directly west to my house where I grew up at 4222 West Washington. Just directly west of that. Actually, my house is the little yellow arrow that's pointing down there. We'll take a closer look at that in a minute. But as you can see, Chicago was colored yellow and red. I mean, most of it. Here along the lakefront, you can see more blue and green. Of course, those were just very desirable areas. And the only way really for African Americans at this time to buy a home was if they had to deal with unscrupulous real estate agents. Blockbusters, they were called. And blockbusters used race baiting as a way to get whites to sell low and then turn around and sell those same buildings at often 2 to 3 times their value to African Americans. And there was a terrible housing crunch, so African Americans were desperate to be able to have a home. So the first thing to know about that is that this is not a mortgage. They sold these buildings on contract. They would have paid cash to the white people for their house, and they might say things like, oh, if you buy it now, I'll give you $9,000, but maybe next week it'll be $8,000. We'd find flyers in our vestibule that would say things like, better get out before it's too late. Or we'd get phone calls at night, and a disembodied voice would say, they're coming, click. It was very frightening, and they were just definitely using race baiting tactics. So they would get whites to sell low, and then when an African American would purchase a house on a contract, it didn't have the protections of a mortgage. So they never owned the deed to the house like you do when you get a mortgage. And they would pay this off in monthly installments at usurious interest rates, by the way, until they would pay as much as they could and keep paying and paying, and then maybe one month they had some trouble and they missed one payment. They'd be evicted. And then these unscrupulous real estate agents could sell that same house over and over again many times. I highly recommend that you go to my website under resources. If you see book at the top and then there's a drop-down menu for resources, I have lots of books and videos that talk about redlining and explain what it is. But one of the most interesting is a 1962 Saturday Evening Post article called Confessions of a Blockbuster. And actually it wasn't written by a real blockbuster, but someone who was trying to expose them and wrote it in the first person. But it is amazing and distressing to see how they took advantage of the fact that redlining wouldn't give mortgages to Black people, and how these race baiting blockbusters could take advantage of that. Now, this is a close-up of my neighborhood. We've now come into, you can see Garfield Park on the right. It's that rectangle that's all in white. Again, the orange arrow points to my house. If you see the X's there, those X's represent commercial districts. And I will tell you that the Madison-Pulaski, often called the Madison-Crawford business district, was one of the most vibrant in the city. We had every kind of store you can imagine. we had hardware stores, we had double bakeries, we had clothing stores, we had 2 dime stores, there were furniture stores. Basically, it was like a small town. Anything you wanted to get, you could get within a few blocks of where we lived. The A&P was just a block away. That was eventually burned down. So, you know, the fact that it was colored yellow is sort of a puzzle to me because it was really a very vibrant neighborhood. And one thing to know about these maps is there is commentary that goes along with each of them. So if you do decide to check out mappinginequality.com, be sure to look at the commentary. It's very enlightening. Sometimes they would say things like threatened with Negro encroachment. So yeah, it's something that is, you know, shocking to us today. So also the FHA underwriting manual purposely wanted to keep the races apart. Here's a quote from that manual. The protection against adverse influences includes the prevention of the infiltration of inharmonious racial groups. So in their great wisdom, they felt that inharmonious, meaning racial groups that were different, black and white. Sometimes they were also prejudiced against foreigners. In some of these commentary, you will see something like Italians moving in. But the ones who really bore the brunt of this were the African Americans. Here's another quote. To maintain a neighborhood's stability, it should, quote, continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. Nearly 65% of all the areas that were redlined or graded hazardous by HOLC are minority neighborhoods now. So this, the segregation that came about because of redlining, which is de jure segregation, which means by law, versus de facto segregation, which would mean just because people of like backgrounds would like to live together. This is very definitely de jure segregation. It's by policy. So that damage that was caused from redlining still is with us, that racism. Now today in these poor neighborhoods, there's pollution is heavier in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And as you probably have heard, pollution increases the risk for contracting COVID because pollution gives people asthma. Asthma makes your lungs less strong, and so they're not able to fight as well against COVID-19, and it leads to worse outcomes, health outcomes, and more death. A Brookings Institute Gallup study, now this is another impact of redlining, this is the financial impact. This Brookings Institution Gallup study found that the average home in a majority Black neighborhood is undervalued by $48,000 compared to an identical home in an identical all-white neighborhood. So taken all together, this represents about $156 billion in cumulative losses accruing to Black homeowners. So we're still paying the price for systemic racism. Chicago has the largest life expectancy gap between Blacks and whites of any large city in the country. There's a 30-year difference in communities just 9 miles apart. Streeterville residents, who are mostly very well off and white, can expect to live to about 90. They have access to everything they need, great health care, fresh air. But Englewood residents, who are mostly Black on the south side, on average die by the age of 60. Now that's pretty damning. And I would say, while this is comparing Englewood, that you would find similar results if you talked about the west side of Chicago where I grew up. It's been 52 years since we had the riots after Martin Luther King's death. But many of the areas in both the south side and the west side, as you saw, those vacant lots are still with us. And the product of the pollution that is often brought into Black neighborhoods is a contributing factor to the double deaths of African Americans versus white Americans from COVID-19. So redlining created segregation and underfunded communities. As we've just mentioned, concentrated poverty. Concentrated poverty often leads to drug dealing. There's a lot of drug dealing that goes on the west side. Shootings, just a couple blocks from where I grew up. This was like about last year, I read the statistic that it had more shootings than any other neighborhood in Chicago, and it was a couple blocks away from where I grew up. Extreme heat, this is something we don't think about, but actually with climate change, these areas that have so few trees and a lot of concrete and these vacant lots that absorb heat as well, they create heat that can sometimes be 9 degrees hotter than other areas of the city. So that also represents a terrible health outcome. There's less access to health care, and I'm sure you've all heard of food deserts. So less access to fresh fruits and vegetables. There are a lot of individuals and churches that are trying to change that by growing fresh fruits, fresh vegetables. We don't do too well with fruits here, so that people can have access to healthy food. And as we've said before, twice as many Blacks are dying from COVID-19 as whites. And across the United States, coronavirus has really devastated communities of color. This has affected Hispanic Americans as well. So that's the Bloomberg City Lab gave us that. Now, again, talking about financial issues, the wealth gap that we have in this country can be directly related to redlining. Black families were not allowed to invest in property like my grandparents had and my parents had. From the 1930s to 1968, when the FHA officially ended redlining, that was called the Fair Housing Act that ended redlining in 1968. Now, redlining was officially ended then, but it still exists in subtle ways. For example, in 2017, there was a study done by the PBS NewsHour in conjunction with Reveal, the Center for Investigative Reporting. And they had used a computer to crunch about 30 million mortgages. And they found that whites were getting mortgages at 3 times the rate of Blacks, even though there was, if you looked at the paperwork, you wouldn't find anything amiss, except somehow these banks, either by meeting the person or seeing where they live, is coming to the conclusion that this might be a bad risk. And it could be implicit bias. That is one of the things. I just saw an article pulled up recently that talked about how many people of color try to whiten up their resumes, they call it, so that they're more likely to get an interview. So whether people do it intentionally or not, there's a lot of implicit bias that goes on. That means we all have bias. So let's put that aside as being evil. Everybody has bias. Implicit bias is bias you're not aware of and often can make you, and police officers especially, treat African Americans differently from the way they treat white Americans. But getting back to the wealth gap, because Blacks couldn't invest in property, they weren't able to create intergenerational wealth like my parents had. They had a building. When my mom died, I sold the building. My brothers and I shared in the receipts from that building. Today, Black families only hold 5 to 7% the wealth that white families hold. Sometimes it might go up to 10%, and some studies say 10%, but I've never seen it more than 10%. That is a huge hit on families when it comes to dealing with crises, such as we're in right now. They have no cushion to be able to fall back on, no financial cushion, and they aren't able to pass on this wealth to their children and grandchildren, helping them to go to college. All the kinds of things that we as middle-class Americans want to be able to do. So this was a huge hit for African American families. Their wealth was drastically reduced because they weren't able to invest in property. And I want to just mention, some people might say, well, they could invest after, 1968 and the Fair Housing Act was passed, they could buy property. The problem is that property values exploded at a much higher rate than salaries. So a house that an African American family could have afforded, let's say in the 40s, 50s, even early 60s, they could no longer afford by, let's say, the 1980s and 2000s. It had just gotten completely out of reach. So that is what I had to say about redlining and my book Redlined. Again, it interweaves the history of redlining with my parents' story of caring for tenants and property before, during, and after the racial changes in our neighborhood. They kept these. I sold the building that I grew up in that I showed you the picture of after my mom died in 1994. My grandparents moved to West Garfield Park in 1912. So we had a presence in that neighborhood for virtually the entire 20th century. And I wanted to both document a lot of that as well as familial struggles that many of you will identify with. It's a memoir, not an academic book. Again, on my website, there are many fine academic books I could recommend. But I think what this book does is allows people to learn more about redlining within the context of a really moving story. So I hope hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I've certainly enjoyed giving it. And again, I want to thank Wendy and the Levy Senior Center Foundation for inviting me. And I'm happy to take any questions.